Hello and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Marc Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
And with us today is a special guest, Dan, my brother. What's up, Dan?
Hello.
All right, so this is the final installment in our series After the Bomb, sci-fi movies of the 1950s, and today we'll be discussing 1958's The Blob.
Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor, right through the door and all around the wall. A splotch, a blotch, be careful of the blob. Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor, right through the door and all around the wall. A splotch, a blotch, be careful of the blob. Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor, right through the door and all...
The Blob is an independently made 1958 American sci-fi horror film produced by Jack H. Harris, directed by Irvin Ewerth, and written by Kay Lineker and Theodore Simonson. The Blob tells the story of a teenager, played by Steve McQueen, and his date for the evening, played by Annette Cousseau, fighting an amorphous gelatin blob from space that has crash-landed on Earth and consumes every living thing it comes across, and grows in size with each thing it devours.
Yes, very American, very quintessential 50s horror, I would say. Still sci-fi, though, but we're definitely veering more towards the horror genre with this one, I would say. Which in some way, this film, Jeremy, I would say, feels like the culmination of all the films we discussed in this series so far. And at the same time, it's something very different. This doesn't actually deal with any radiation or anything atomic. It just deals with an alien life form, which is something new to the series. But in a lot of ways, there are many of the same types of fears and similar ideas at play here. Similar fear of the unknown, especially. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the fear of the unknown, kind of the strange science, not that this is coming from, as a lot of the other films we've talked about, coming from nuclear experimentation, but just kind of things that we don't understand their inner workings, we don't understand what stops them, what we have to do to take them on.
This is maybe the epitome of that. It's just
it's
substance.
Last time we talked about Fiend Without a Face, and this isn't. It doesn't. No face, no body, no discernible body parts. It's the Blob. There's nothing else to it.
And like Fiend Without a Face, it's also part of the Criterion Collection as well.
Yes.
Well, Dan, our guest, we want to bring you in here, and you're a big movie guy. I know that. No one else knows that, but you also make films yourself, and was probably partly responsible for getting me into movies as well when we were younger. So I know that you have seen this before, correct? This movie?
Yes.
Yeah. And what are your I guess just general thoughts and feelings about this one, the original Blob?
I was surprised by how much it felt like very it had a very classical feel to it, like a lot of films from that time.
Americana.
Yeah, which is interesting because of the low budget it had.
Yeah. Very low budget.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah. It definitely has that feel where it's almost like American Graffiti kind of.
Yeah.
They actually do almost Drag Race, I guess, at one point.
Yeah, I was gonna say like the teenagers are straight out of like Rebel Without a Cause almost.
Yeah, and like those movies, they're always played by older. Steve McQueen was what, 28 in this
I believe he was 28 years old, playing maybe 16, 17.
Right. Although this is one of his earliest film roles. So
I think
we just.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think it also has like the kind of distrust of authority that Rebel Without a Cause has.
Yeah, for sure.
The police can't save anyone in this movie.
Yeah. Although the one sergeant, I guess, towards the end starts to believe him a little bit more, but yeah, for sure, I would say for most of the movie, the police are seen as kind of like this outside entity and not really helping them, and I mean, no one believes them really, but especially the police
Mm-hmm.
are really no help in this one.
Yeah, no one believes the young people.
Yep. That's how it goes in many of these movies. But yeah, so this one, just we can't really talk about it without. Well, at least I really want to talk about the opening credits, the title song of the movie. We have talked about the credits of all these films that we've talked about in this series and how great they all are. This one is extremely 180, very different than anything in the other films, but also extremely and tonally different than anything in this film itself, the film that we're about to watch. And there's a reason for that, actually. In fact, it was kind of the point. Apparently, the song was made to kind of let people know in the beginning that, hey, this isn't going to be too scary. We're going to just have, we're going to have a good time with this blob. We're going to dance around and I don't know, not exactly sure what they're going for. It's like a beach party song kind of, but it's a great song. I mean, I love it. I listened to it probably 5 times before we even recorded today.
Well, and I think that this song that we get right at the beginning is one of the things that has made this film so enduring. Because this is a film that even if you don't really know movies that well, you've probably heard of it. I know for me,
in some ways, it kind of brings it into that cult territory even right from the start.
Exactly, yeah. And it's something that kind of made it just like hang around a little bit more. I'm looking at it now. It looks like that song actually. So it was written by Burt Bacharach. Which is one of the co-writers. Fun Burt Bacharach fact for all of the Burt Bacharach fans out there.
For all you fans out there,
a really difficult sentence to say. Burt Bacharach fact. But it peaked at number 33 on the Billboard chart, which is not bad. That's a pretty solid tune.
That's up there. Yeah,
that's up there, and that's the kind of thing where like you get a song that goes like that. That probably hung around as long, if not longer, than the movie. And you got to think, especially we're talking about 1958. A song that is hitting 33 on the chart is being played on the radio a lot. So it is one of those things where I do think that the song probably, the movie in its own right obviously is a cult classic, but I think that the fact that this song got this kind of airplay and hung around, I think definitely is one of the things that contributed to this one sticking around in
brought
such
it
a
to
way.
the next level.
Yeah,
definitely. What do you think, Dan? I know you love this song, so.
I love all Bacharach.
Yeah, he's a big Bacharach fan.
You're a Bacharach guy.
But yeah, this song is just, I mean, even just taken on its own, it's like it has its own life sort of, and I'm sure it gets played on many Halloween mixes and things like that. So yeah, there's that other element to it, which is just really cool right out the gate. And again, it was made to be non-threatening. It was made to kind of let people know that they should hang around and watch this movie. It's not going to be too scary, because I guess at the time they were kind of worried about that. And Jeremy, like you mentioned, this was 1958, which is actually the same year as the last 2 films that we spoke about, Fiend Without a Face and also Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. So big year for these kinds of movies. So just to go into like a little brief synopsis of kind of what occurs in the film. So it starts with an old man played by Olin Howland, which he was also in Them, actually. He also appeared briefly in that film. So another little connection there. He finds an impact crater of a small meteorite. And within that, the meteorite actually cracks open. The outer shell breaks open, and we see the inner substance eking out, and it actually crawls onto the man's arm. And this is the first time we get a glimpse of what the blob is. And that's right off the bat, too. I mean, this is the very first scene of the movie. So I thought that was a really effective opening, actually. It really gets you right into the movie. How did you both feel about that opening?
It's interesting to see a familiar face.
Yeah,
kind of scattered with all the no-name actors.
Yeah, I feel like he was... Well, this is actually the very last film he was in. I believe he passed away right after this. So, yeah, and he was kind of a veteran of these types of films. And like I said, he showed up in one of the movies we talked about in this series, Them. And I'm sure he was kind of in, I think, some other cult films as well. So, yeah, it was interesting starting off with him. But just the whole atmosphere of that first scene I thought was very appropriate, I guess I would say. Just, completely unexplainable. Something literally crash lands from outer space. And that's how we start off. And then from there we go, we meet our main characters. Well, actually, even before that, we do see the main characters, Steve McQueen, again, around 28 years old, playing a teenager.
Also
Steve
named
McQueen. Steve. Yeah, also playing Steve Andrews. And so this is Steve McQueen's, like I said, first starring role, and the main hero of our film. And he, along with his girlfriend, Jane, they're I guess they were probably supposed to be smooching in the car. I don't know. They didn't really show anything. I guess it was part of the code at the time. But they're in the car together, and they spot something falling from the sky, and that's when we see what that is. And also, sort of, I mentioned quintessential 50s. This is kind of like the quintessential 50s opening. I felt like the two teenagers in the car together, and sort of like a horror trope that we'd see again and again after this film, and before this film also. And so, like I said, he's the main hero of the film, and so him along with his girlfriend Jane, and Dr. Hallen as well, they try to figure out what this alien life form is, and perhaps more importantly, how they can stop it. And I know Steve McQueen is a huge movie star. He wasn't actually in too many films, but the films he was in were they were classics and up there as some of the all-time greats. So it is cool to see him in his first big role here. And his character is seen as straight-laced and I guess square compared to the ruffians he's hanging around with, these other characters.
Go into the spooky show.
Yeah, the spooky show. I want to talk about that. Yeah, they're in, trying to get into some trouble, and he plays it pretty straight though. I guess because he's supposed to be the hero of the film.
Very concerned.
And he's very concerned about everything. He wants to get to the bottom of this, and his trusty girlfriend at his side. So the runtime of this film, Jeremy, a little bit longer than a couple of the other ones
Slightly,
we talked about. This, it's it's around an hour and a half, hour 26 minutes, so pretty standard here. But it moves. It's it goes from one scene to the next, and another notable scene that we come to is the body of the old man. Once he's been, I guess, taken over or consumed by this being, he's on an examination table, and this is I would think like one of the first big scenes of the movie where. At this point, he is completely absorbed by the blob, and then actually the nurse is she tries to throw acid on it as it tries to move and kind of creep around, and she is also consumed, although this is off screen, which is something that happens frequently in the movie. A lot of the action, a lot of the horror is off screen, and we see also, this is when we first see that it has started to grow, this entity, this pulsating. You really can only call it a blob, I guess.
There's no other real name. It's just kind of perfect. The perfect name for this film is there's just nothing else they could have called it.
Apparently, they were going to call it the glob, but and for legal reasons they couldn't do that. But I think the blob is just perfect.
Much better. Much better.
Yeah, more memorable. We see it. It has started to grow, and we see like there's some like shots of its shadow, and it kind of. There's one shot of it kind of rolling into view, and that's the first time that we really see it in all its glory. And eventually it overtakes the doctor himself, and this is witnessed by Steve through the window. And again, this is almost all off screen, but we do see some quick shots of the blob itself, and see just how much it's grown already. And when the doctor is being consumed by the blob, there's actually more footage of this death that was actually cut out of the film, which happens a couple times. Have you seen this footage actually, Dan or Jeremy?
I have not.
The deleted footage of this film. Okay, I think I did a while ago, but so it really does to show him actually being engulfed by this blob, and which I guess was considered too violent or too obscene at the time of the movie's release. So I don't know. How do you think the movie loses something from not seeing those types of scenes, or do you think it's still just as horrific not seeing it? I mean, how do you guys feel about that?
I think it kind of adds to the mythology of it all, not seeing it. You just imagining how, because this is the question I always had, I guess, watching this movie, and I think what I love so much is that you don't ever really get an answer how it happens. Is how these people are transformed from people into part of the blob. How the makeup of a human body becomes like gelatinous. And I think if we saw too much of it, you would, as you're watching the film, you might start to ask too many questions. But I think that one of the lovely things about this film is that you really don't have to question it. It kind of just shows up and you're along for the ride, and it doesn't really. Yeah.
It's like the song. You just kind of groove to it.
Yeah, it's not really asking you to think too much about, as opposed to some of the other films we discussed. This one's not really asking you to think about the science at all.
Yeah,
like there's no real examination of outer space. Like people are just like, oh, there's a meteor. That's cool. Like no one even seems that thrilled or weirded out by the fact that all this is happening at the same time that a meteor has just landed.
Yeah.
It
I
really
feel like
kind of ignores it.
Yeah, the meteor is like long forgotten by the end of the movie.
Yeah.
You're right.
Which,
Yeah, I forgot until I just read my note there.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's an alien film, but it doesn't really get into that at all, which I think is one of those things that makes it kind of light and fun.
Mhm.
It's just you're not sitting there pondering the meaning of all of this. You just understand that it's kind of fun watching
just
this
there.
unknown
Yeah.
thing take on a small town, and it's also just fun watching these characters. In my opinion,
Yeah.
these are kind of more interesting and entertaining characters than a lot of the ones you see in these kind of sci-fi
Yeah.
movies. Particularly,
Yeah.
and it helps, I think, and has been helped over time by the fact that Steve McQueen became such a big star. Because when we're watching it, you're not just watching some random B movie actor who this is the only thing you ever see them in. You're seeing someone from the Magnificent Seven. You're seeing someone from The Great Escape taking on the Blob, which really it really adds to this sense of like grand. It makes it kind of grandiose, but in a really comical, offbeat way.
Yeah. I definitely agree. I didn't really think of that until you said it, Jeremy, but this has almost little to no explanation of anything. And a lot of that is because the characters themselves don't know anything about what's going on. Like, the main character saw something in the sky that crash landed, but that's about it. That's all they know, really. That's really, you really are just along for the ride. It's like, this thing is here and now we have to kill it.
Yeah, and it gives it more impact when it starts to grow larger and you start to see it.
Because you don't know. Yeah, you don't know what to expect. Whereas with the movie Them, when we talked about that movie, there's actually a whole PowerPoint scene, we called it, where he's kind of talking about the scientist is talking about the ants and we learned about ants, and that has its place. But I think in this type of film, I think it does work really well just to kind of be a ride that we go along with.
Yeah.
And discover things along with them and stuff like that. So, definitely. So it's a little different in that regard as well. And so eventually Steve, the character Steve, convinces the police to come check out what's going on. And once the doctor has been engulfed by this being, and they of course are very skeptical, like you said, Dan, that everyone's pretty skeptical of what's going on and what these crazy kids are talking about. And eventually Steve and Jane meet up with their friends at the spooky show. Good old spooky show.
The Picture House.
At the Picture House, tell them what's going on. So they go to this movie theater. Side note: this movie theater is is it the Colonial, Dan?
Yeah.
I don't want to get Colonial Theater in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, which is very close to where me and my brother are from, actually.
That's great. And
I think it's a Downingtown diner they go to after this. So yeah, a little bit of a local scenery there. I think we've actually both been to that theater, Dan. But anyway, so they go to this theater, and they also we see the Blob at this point has gotten into a grocery store, and that's where they track it, where the main character Steve and Jane track the Blob, and where we really get to see just how big it's gotten at this point. And it tries to attack them, and it also ekes under the door and sneaks out. And by this point, the whole town has become aware of that something is going on. Again, no one really knows exactly what's going on, but they know something is happening. And they even sound the air raid sirens at this point, and a large crowd forms to where Steve tries to warn everybody about the danger, about how the Blob has grown. And at this point, finally, the police lieutenant especially actually does believe him now at this point. And they start to try to take action. But at this point, it's a bit too late, because there's that famous movie theater scene, probably the most iconic probably the most iconic scene in the movie, where the Blob ekes into the projector room through a vent, and it rises up and engulfs the projectionist. And again, mostly unseen. I think this is another one of those deleted scenes, actually. Until we see just how big it has gotten, and it overtakes the entire projection room, and eventually even the theater itself. So it actually squeezes up against the glass and breaks through, and this results in the iconic scene of the fleeing patrons running from the entrance of the movie theater. And that's actually reenacted, I think, every year, right, Dan? At the they hold a Blob festival. We wanted to go the one year. I don't think we actually ended up going, but they reenact that scene, so everyone runs out of the theater. And the patrons escape into the local diner, where they take refuge, and where Steve and Jane also are. And this is our climactic scene of the movie, So pretty short movie. You can see it forming on the outsides of the windows through matte paintings, which is pretty cool. Little use of matte paintings there, and slowly trying to make its way in. And the police have a plan to drop a power line on it, and our heroes hide in the cellar as the plan takes place. And officer shoots off a power line, falls on the blob, and electrifies it, but it keeps going. And at this point, the diner is now on fire. So things have gotten pretty dire. It actually is very close to ending on sort of a down note, actually.
Yeah.
If something doesn't happen in these last couple of minutes, which of course it does. The characters pretty much prepare to die. Actually, it's kind of like interesting. They all kind of like they huddle together, like, well, I guess this is it. Like, so they're getting ready to be engulfed either by this entity or by the fire, until Steve realizes that they have a fire extinguisher, and that fire extinguisher has CO2, or just, quote unquote cold, that kills the blob. So cold kills the blob. And the police and townspeople, they grab every fire extinguisher they can find and use it to fight back and defeat this blob. So they freeze it solid, and the blob is now huge and frozen. And what do? They take it to the Arctic or something. It's the actual quote. Take it to the Arctic or something, drop it where it will never thaw out.
Until global warming hits.
I was going to say,
well, that's what I was getting to, yeah.
The blob is coming back, folks. The blob is coming back.
Because they actually say it's not dead, just frozen.
Yeah.
Because they can't kill it. They don't know how to kill it. So they say, like, we're safe as long as the Arctic stays cold. And that's the end of the movie. And it's oddly prescient of them.
So get ready.
A little foreboding there. I don't know how we're doing on that front, but yeah, that was especially ominous. I would say even more than they intended at that time. Yeah. So that's the end of the movie, though. So they freeze it solid, and that's how they get themselves out of this. And do you think it's an appropriate ending to the movie, that is just kind of freeze it?
Yeah, I don't know where else you can kind of go with it. I don't think you really can.
Yeah.
I think it's better. At least personally, I thought it was cool that they don't kill the blob. It's not one of those things. I think a lot of the time, you see sci-fi movies or horror movies, and what's cool is, you think about like Michael Myers, and like Michael Myers, pretty much, spoiler alert, my apologies if you haven't seen Halloween, but a lot of the time at the end of Halloween movies, he dies, quote unquote, but then all of a sudden he'll be gone, and it kind of opens up the door for him to come back, and he's kind of like this ultimate villain that can never be killed. And I think the blob is kind of the same way because of this ending, where it's not the kind of thing that you can kill. It's just you kind of got to just have to put it somewhere else and hope that it doesn't get stronger.
Just put it where no one can see it.
Yeah.
Well, Jeremy, even in this series, we talked about Godzilla, and they kill, destroy the creature at the end of that movie, and of course he comes back for many, many sequels.
Yeah.
And and even in Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, they are able to kill her at the end. So yeah, even though they're dead, they're never really dead. But it is interesting to see them try to take a different route with this one and try to have a sort of a different kind of solution to it. But also, much like those other films, Jeremy, that we've seen in this series, once the threat is neutralized, the movie's over. They don't linger. They just kind of, they don't overstay their welcome. That's for sure. They kind of just end the movie. But that's something that we saw in pretty much all of these movies. Once the creature or the big baddie was gone, the movie's over. So,
which is so cool. I don't know. I kind of love that.
Yeah, no, I'm a fan.
Yeah.
Why linger? Why, there's no reason to overstay your welcome.
Yeah.
And that's partly why all these movies are pretty short too, I guess you could say. So you can see echoes of this movie in countless other films. I mean, this is a hugely iconic film, much like Godzilla that we talked about. So I kind of like that we're beginning and ending the series with really big movies in this genre and just really big cult films also. Yeah. But Dan, how do you, to ask you first, I guess, how do you feel about the legacy of this movie? Like, do you think it's well regarded for a reason? I mean, how do you feel about it, and just kind of the general, how you view the film?
I actually was wondering why do you guys think it caught on so much in its day, even?
Well, Jeremy, you want to
take
a stab at that?
So one thing that I was thinking about, and I'd love to hear from both of you what your thoughts are, the question that kept popping up in my mind as I watched this film is, what is this movie about? And that can be interpreted, either as, what is it about, on an ideological level? But for me, I kind of meant it more in a literal, what is the focus of this film? What is the main thing it's about? And I realized that for me, this film was really about American teenagerdom. It wasn't really about the Blob. It's like even, I mean, you have your opening theme song, but the first shot of the movie, Mark, as you mentioned, is a couple of teenagers, sitting in a car making out. And I think that that's really the thing that the movie's about. We get these kind of really quintessential aspects of teenage life, kind of hanging out with your friends, driving in the cars, like we said, like almost like an American Graffiti or something like that. And I think that that's, for me, is the thing that has made it endure so well. It's not, I mean, the monster and all of that are really interesting. And I think that it's also just this idea, the name too, and just the concept in general, like the Blob. It sounds like a ridiculously silly thing.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that it's really a movie that's about teenagers, which is something that, I mean, we've seen it before this film, and we've seen it countless times after, particularly with the slasher films, of the very late 70s and early 80s, where the teenagers are the central characters in some kind of horror, but very rarely is the film actually about being a teenager. It's normally about the horror of it all. But this one, I think what has made it kind of hang around so long is the fact that it really just focuses on I don't want to say the fun of being a teenager, but kind of the problems you face of being a teenager. Nobody listens to you.
I say no one listens.
Your friends are a little bit incompetent. You're trying to manage a relationship, and you're trying to manage, but at the same time, you might be dealing.
They're always
with
trying to
problem.
get you to come to the. Yeah, they're always trying to get you to come to the spooky show at the picture house.
Your parents are grounding you. It's not that they're just not believing you. Like, they're straight up prohibiting you from taking care of business.
Yeah.
And it's like,
you're like, Mom, I'm 28 years old. Come on.
Yeah, let me out of the house. But I think all of those things made it probably at the time something that teenagers would go see, and it was funny, but it was funny and it was scary. But it was something where they probably watched it in the same way that they would have watched Rebel Without a Cause and said, "Oh yeah, like that feels closer to my life than these other procedural horror films." That
a little more surface level, a little more relatable.
Yeah, even just the fact that they're in a theater watching a movie, like
oh yeah, it's very very meta in that moment for sure.
Which that scene was also featured in John Landis's first film, Schlock.
Oh right, well there is a connection there. One of the producers on this film. Actually, let me get his name because
was it Harris?
It was Harris, yeah. Jack H. Harris produced this film, and before this, he had produced Schlock, Dan, which is what Dan really loves that film. We watched it together. Also, Dark Star, which we've talked about on this film for our lo-fi sci-fi series, and also Equinox, which is a great
one of my favorites.
Me and Dan love that film as well. It's a super low budget, like student made sci-fi fantasy kind of film. And
I was actually thinking about it a lot while watching this.
Yeah, kind of has the same feel. So there's a reason for that, apparently. So Jeremy, you mentioned this film is about teenage life and things like that, and I definitely agree with that. And to me, it's also about fear. It's about the fear of the unknown, which we try not to bring current events into this too much, but we keep touching on it because it's on the back of all our minds.
This series is just too perfect.
You couldn't not think about it.
It's a pandemic we're in right now with coronavirus, and we're kind of on lockdown and in quarantine. So watching these types of films, and especially this film, just felt really like on the nose, sort of. And
if only the fire extinguishers worked.
I know.
Yeah, really.
If that was a solution to all our problems.
Give everyone a quick spritz.
And there is something like just so simplistic about this movie too, because it is just this entity that you don't know what it is, and everyone is scared of it. But on a certain level, it's like almost therapeutic because it could be anything.
Yeah.
You could project any kind of fear onto that.
Yeah.
And I think that's also part of what makes this film so lasting and so revered and an inspiration on many other horror films to come. And because it is truly horrific, I would say even more than sci-fi, even though it is an alien entity, there's a lot of horror in the film. And, we've talked before in the series about different abstract entities even. We've gone from monsters and giant insects to really abstract, actual and Fiend Without a Face, these invisible beings, and then crawling brains and spinal cords that attack people. But this is something else entirely. It's kind of the point of the whole thing. I think it's this alien life form that is so foreign and so unexplainable to the residents of this town that and that's where the horror comes from. So it's a bit more psychological in that regard, just a little bit. And there's, than some of the films we talked about, at least I would say in the series. Would you agree with that though?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think it's so cool that it does just become this kind of pure abstraction. There's just there's nothing concrete about what's happening in this.
Yeah, it's literally like jelly like this creature. So
just a collection of all of your fears.
exactly, that's kind of what it is. Whether or not they were going for that or not, that's what it ends up being. So I did want to talk about the effects a little bit, just focus on those for a little bit, because we try to do that for each of these movies. And the blob itself, it was created with apparently a modified weather balloon in the early shots, and then in the later shots they used colored silicone gel. And some of the shots, like I mentioned, there was the matte drawings or matte paintings as it really increased in size, and they weren't, I guess, sure how else to portray it at that point, because it's very noticeable when they use those. Yeah, right. And there are, this use of miniatures and things like that, particularly in the movie theater scene and the diner scenes toward the end, when the blob has really grown. So there's a little bit of mixture of effects here, and I thought it was pretty effective.
Do you know what they made it out of?
Well, it's a mixture of, there was red dye involved, I know that, and silicone pretty much was like a mixture of those, and I guess maybe some other things were thrown in, but it's actually never dried out, which is kind of interesting. It's kept to this day in the original 5-gallon pail that it was, I guess.
Oh, wow.
So it's still alive. The blob actually has never...
it actually still lives. So
yeah, I think one of the things that's cool about the effects in this movie that makes it work particularly well is that you don't know what it's supposed to be like. It's like you look at like Attack of the 50-Foot Woman or Fiend Without a Face. Like, we kind of know what we definitely know what a woman looks like, and we know what a large woman would look like. So we can kind of tell when it's off, and same with like a brain, floating around. Whereas this, it's hard to critique the effects in this because we don't know what a blob is supposed to look like,
Yeah.
There's nothing to compare it to.
Right.
It works because it can't not work. It's a moving blob, It's like it might be if it scares you or not, but like in terms of being believable, I don't know. At least for me,
they could have used actual jelly, and it probably would have been just as effective.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it really could have been anything. Yeah, and the shots are really quick too. I mean, you don't linger on any of these effect shots for very long at all, which helps, I would say.
Absolutely.
And I was also interested to learn that this was independently produced, which I wasn't aware of.
Yeah.
So it was picked up by Paramount Pictures eventually, and that was for use on the bottom half of a double bill with Paramount's other production, I Married a Monster from Outer Space, which also came out in 1958. And so, but eventually the early marketing tests for this, and I guess the initial bookings they did, it showed that this film was doing much better, and a larger share of the audience and the ticket buyers were going to see this film rather than the top billed picture. So this became the main feature, and as a result of that, more money was spent on its promotion and things like that. So that's also part of the reason why it much like the Blob, grew and grew and kind of became what, sorry for that, but I had to make that comparison at some point. It grew and grew until it became what it is, which is the Blob, which, by any other name, I mean, it just is its own entity. And there was a remake in 1988 as well, which the same producer, Jack Harris, did. He also produced that one as well. And that movie is completely different. And Jeremy, I don't think you've seen that one.
I've not seen that one.
Dan, have you seen?
I haven't.
Have you seen the remake? You haven't seen it. It's very much. How do I put this? I don't want to say.
Doesn't it have like a face?
It's a lot more extreme, I guess I would say. It really goes for it. It goes for broke, which I actually kind of like because it really differentiates itself from this film. This one's from 1958, and then so 30 years later, 1988, they made the 80s version of this, which is it's extremely gory. It's just really over the top. So I think in its own right, it is a cult film in its own way, that remake, and it's very, that one is very well regarded as well. A lot of people enjoy that movie. I think it's just extremely different than this one. They kind of took that basic idea of the Blob and then they just turned it up to 11. So that one is worth checking out if you're just kind of into those kind of more gory. It has that feel to it where it's just very kind of sleazy and not at all the 50s wholesome teenagers or anything like that. So, so very different, but worth checking out in its own right. And so the credited director on this film is Irvin S. Yeworth Jr. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Who didn't do too much other than this. He did do some other horror films around the same time. But there's also an uncredited director on this film, Russell S. Dalton Jr., and he has a pretty interesting story. He became a religious film director and producer, Christian films, I believe. So that's just an interesting, I guess, path that he went on, or maybe he was already on it at this point. And I read that he felt that there was a message being said to support teenagers in this movie, and I could definitely see that. Because as you talked about, Jeremy, I mean, teenagers are a focal point of this movie, and I guess he wanted to reach the youth or talk about the youth. I'm not sure exactly what. But yeah, I found that interesting.
Yeah, he apparently made the highest grossing religious film at the time, which is
really?
Thief in the Night.
Okay. So that was that before this film or
that was
around
after
the same time? Okay.
I think a lot of the film was made with his money.
Right. So that's why he's
from those
I guess,
films.
Okay, so he's uncredited, but apparently had a pretty big hand in this as well. And there is a local connection for me and my brother, at least, because this was filmed in and around areas in PA where we are close to. So Phoenixville, PA was, I guess, the main area. Downingtown as well. And there's the annual Blob Fest, which we mentioned is held every year, every summer. It's a 3-day event, and they do that recreation there of the running out of the movie theater. And they actually had the blob itself. We talked about how it's still around, and they actually had the blob itself on display there as well. So
that's incredible.
Just a little extra trivia there. But yeah, I think we also talked about the title, the Blob. I mean, it's just so iconic. They did change the title from the Glob to the Blob, and I think it actually worked out even for better that way because it's just so iconic. And also they apparently the producers were aware of how ridiculous not only the plot of the movie was, but how this title sounded, because they actually wanted comedians, like stand-up comedians, to pick up on this, and I guess talk show hosts and things like that. They wanted them to talk about this movie and talk about how ridiculous it was, because that was to them it was free advertising. So they would essentially get free plugs on national television. So I found that pretty interesting because you watch this movie, and with some of these cult movies, you wonder, like, did they know what they were doing?
Yeah, this one almost felt like they knew what they were doing, but I don't think they knew exactly how right they were doing it. You know what I mean? Like it seemed like they're kind of like, yeah, we can make this thing, it'll be cool, but I don't think they realized exactly how perfect it was.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and this apparently the entity itself was referred to as the Mass in the shooting script. So I guess they had to do some brainstorming, kind of figure out what to call this thing. So yeah, so I would say maybe it was half and half. Maybe some people knew what they were going for, what they wanted to achieve with this, and I'm sure others were just trying to make the best movie they could, which it's what most filmmakers end up doing. So, but I think it works, and I think it's iconic for a reason. But we're going to do a separate conclusion, I guess, for the series, but any last things you want to say, any parting words about the Blob? Dan, we'll start with you.
I wonder why they didn't make a sequel sooner.
Yeah, I wonder that as well. All these other films, they
especially with that ending.
Yeah.
That ending, I know. Actually, is there a son of the Blob? I saw some image, but I didn't know if it was maybe just photoshopped or something. I should probably look that up.
It's from the 70s, I think, though.
Beware the Blob is what it's called.
Oh,
1972. Beware the Blob.
Okay.
Yeah. So. But,
wow. AKA Son of the Blob. Okay.
But still, long
that
time.
wasn't until
That's it's 14
That's what
years.
I'm saying. It's weird.
Yeah. You would have think that it would have gotten it like
this.
6 months later at the way they just cranked them out back then.
Yeah.
Oh, apparently it does. So it starts with, I guess not the same character, but someone returning to Los Angeles from the North Pole. So I guess bringing with him a small sample of mysterious frozen substance. Ah, okay.
Interesting. That's actually pretty fascinating. That might be a one to check out.
It took them that long to come up with that. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I can imagine them sitting around for 14 years saying, how do we get it
Yeah. Wait a second. It's still alive.
Yeah, you would think
They
with
never
all the
killed it.
money that they made.
Yeah. Oh, Dick Van Patten's in it. How about that? Yeah, interesting. Okay. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know what you mean though, Dan. It's interesting they didn't kind of jump right on this because it was such a kind of a sensation when this came out. But I kind of like that it is just its own thing and exists in its own time period. And like I said, this is very 50s. The remake is very 80s for sure. So I kind of like that.
Yeah. And I think, like we were talking about Equinox, it just shows how much you can achieve with a small budget.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Actually, I did have the number here. The budget, there's different.
We'll never know for
People
sure.
say different things, but yeah, we'll never know for sure. But the number that I guess they officially gave it on Wikipedia was 110,000. So relatively pretty
Low
small for
budget
this
then,
type
but
of
not
film.
like the lowest we've seen, but still a low budget film for the time.
Yeah, and box office was 4 million.
Yeah.
So like we said, it clearly caught on. Yeah,
Good investment.
I guess those stand-up comedians talking about the name, maybe that helped too.
Yeah.
Who knows?
And that song,
but
that
yeah.
catchy, it
That
creeps,
song,
it leaps.
it creeps and it leaps.
Yeah.
Beware.
One thing I just like to call out, just closing thought here, is just, and I have his name pulled up, the really wonderful cinematography by Thomas E. Spalding, who didn't really look like he did any other particularly big movies, but the cinematography, especially for a low budget film, is so beautiful in this. Like not even in a kitschy, campy way.
No.
Like it is the lighting. There were some really cool there were I can think of one, but there were probably more kind of like POV kind of handheld, almost shaky cam shots, which for that era was really really bold and innovative. Like just even looking at some of the stills of like I'm looking at this one shot right now. From the movie theater scene when they're all running out of the Colonial, and the way that the theater is lit up, like it easily looks like it could have been something out of an American Graffiti. You know what I mean? Like it helped. It totally, in my mind, helped define, not necessarily define the look of that era, because I think by 1958 the look of the 50s had kind of already been defined. But I think it helped define how filmmakers and photographers and painters and everybody down the line looked back at the 50s. It really just has this very specific thing that is super rich.
Yeah, it's almost like American Graffiti, where it's kind of nostalgic for that time, even though it's still sort of in that time.
It was that time, yeah.
It was that time, but towards the end of it, I guess.
Yeah, there's like such an elegance to some of the images. And a lot of the shots are played out, like, I guess this was a budgetary reason, but a lot of the shots are played out like wide. There's not a lot of close-ups, but when there are close-ups, it's like very important.
Yeah, it's mostly like more establishing shots, or like you said, wider static shots. But when they do focus on the blob or focus on the action, it's gets you right in there. So it's interesting. I'm actually watching a show on HBO, like very up to date 2020 show, and I was seeing some parallels actually when I watched the blob to how certain like you said, certain shots just have like an energy to them, like these handheld sort of or tracking shots, things like that. So yeah, it definitely was sort of ahead of its time, while also sort of looking back on a certain time period as well. So it's sort of timeless too. I guess that's another reason why.
Like Jeremy said, it's not kitschy at all.
It's not. Like it could have easily been, and it almost seems like it's going to be for a little bit, but then it kind of takes another turn. It veers a different way.
It's a really fine balance between kitsch and elegance. It's fun. It's funny enough. It's kind of goofy enough that you're not sitting there like freaking out about it. Kind of like the theme song. It's like really the theme song.
You keep going back to that.
We talk about how your opening image or your opening moments of a film should really define the whole thing. And I think this really does a great job of that. A minute or two into the movie, you kind of know what the whole thing is about. It's fun. It's you can tap your foot to it, but they're telling you beware. It really sets you up nicely.
Oh, you're saying from even the opening song? I think
the
you're
opening
right.
song. Yeah, it sets you up. You're right in it. You get the tone of the whole film right away.
Yeah,
I believe the song was a studio touch too.
Yeah, it was kind of like last
kind
minute,
of forced upon them.
Right. Well, like I said, it was kind of like we don't want this to be too scary now. Like, and that's also and it goes in line with cutting certain scenes that they felt were maybe too horrific or extreme. So there were smart people behind this movie. There was smart producers and people that they definitely had something in mind they were going for, and I think they achieved it. They really, the way they marketed the film, and we talk about this, if this is intended or not, and I think it, in a lot of ways it was. So yeah, it's a hell of a movie. And like you said, it's in that beginning, not only do we get that kitschy song, but we have just that opening scene of the meteorite crashing and just the fear of the unknown. Like that's kind of what wraps up this whole series for me, Jeremy. Like when I think back, starting with Godzilla, going into Them, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, Fiend Without a Face, and now the Blob. I mean, I was trying to think of what the through line was, and it can't be atomic energy because this last film doesn't have that. It doesn't have any radiation or anything like that, but it does have that unknown, the fear of the unknown, and that sort of is horrific in a lot of ways. And I think that's something that, even if we've maybe veered more into certain territories that were a little more, over the top or could be seen as laughable, I think it's always had that at its core. All these movies we talked about, mostly trying to understand what we can't understand through elements of sci-fi, a little bit more horror, I would say, with this, but you still have sci-fi elements there with the alien being. And I think we've gotten some outstanding examples of the genre because of this. So I think all the films we talked about are definitely worth taking a look at, whether you're a fan of sci-fi, 50s sci-fi, or just want to check out some interesting, unique films that are saying something, but also really fun to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me with these films, what's so fun is that it's really a rabbit hole. And, and we talk about genre a decent amount on this podcast. And I think that in terms of genre, what's fun about this one is it's kind of a bottomless pit. You can really just keep going with these films. Just when you think you've seen all of them, all of these 50 sci-fi films, you'll find another one.
Oh, there's more.
And it'll surprise you. Every single one, there's a through line between all of them, but there's also new and exciting kind of fun things that'll just kind of are just such interesting little finds in every single one of them. And for me, the thing I love about these movies, if we're being totally frank, it's not like they're the most dramatic movies. It's not like they're the scariest movies of all time, but there's a certain feeling that goes along with all of them. And it's just a really fun feeling to be absorbed into, to become part of the blob, if you will. I don't know. It's
just kind of go along with them.
Yeah, you kind of just go along with it, and if you let yourself just get swept up in it, it's just such a good time, such a fun thing to watch. It'll really, really, really kind of transport you to another place in time that kind of never existed, which I think is cool. This isn't what the 1950s were. This is a very specific interpretation of the 1950s. No, yeah, but I think is how a lot of people kind of think of the 1950s. And we've talked about on other episodes through lines to David Lynch. Today we've talked about George Lucas a little bit, and and it's cool because these films really, in a weird way, kind of defined how we looked at what was a really transformative. This is the era that came right after World War II, preceded the sexual revolution in Vietnam. So it was this kind of in-between transitional time in America and America and in the world. We didn't just watch American films here, but the fact that these films, these strange, bizarre artifacts, were what came out of it, I think is a really pretty interesting and fascinating thing to look at.
A lot of it is nostalgia and yearning for what came before. I think you hit it on the head with that, because like we said, a lot of these films are oddly nostalgic and kind of for different reasons, but this one, The Blob particularly, it has that feel to it, where it's very nostalgic, I would say, for a certain time, even though they weren't completely out of that time. I think because things after the bomb, I think things became so different and everything was different at that point, and people just were yearning for a simpler time, I guess. So you see that in a lot of these movies. And they all, these type of 50s sci-fi movies, they hold a soft spot for me. And that probably has something to do with, like I mentioned in the Them episode, in 4th grade, my teacher showing me that movie. Even from that time, I just always had a soft spot for these kind of movies. And I was really glad we got to do a series about these kind of movies, because I think everyone should check them out at some point. They're, a lot of fun, and I think they're very memorable films. But I think that's going to do it for us, right? Anything else you want to throw on top of that, Dan or Jeremy?
Well said.
Well said.
All right. Just want to say thanks to my brother, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on the show. Hopefully you come on again. And Dan is a filmmaker as well. I guess we find him on, YouTube? Where do we find you?
Sure.
Yeah, check him out. Same last name as me. All right. So, yeah, that's going to do it for us today. Jeremy, good as always. We're going to talk about a new series we're cooking up for next time. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.